Well, good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 31st meeting of the Public Audit Committee in 2024. Agenda item 1 is for the committee to decide whether or not to take agenda items 3 and 4 in private this morning. Are we all agreed? Agreed. We are agreed. And our main item is agenda item 2, which is consideration of the Section 23 report produced by the Auditor General into fiscal sustainability and reform in Scotland. So I'm very pleased to welcome our witnesses this morning. We have Stephen Boyle, the Auditor General for Scotland, who's joined this morning by Carol Grant, who's an Audit Director at Audit Scotland, Fiona Diggle, who's an Audit Manager, and Richard Robinson, who's a Senior Manager at Audit Scotland. As usual, Auditor General, we've got some questions to put to you, but before we get to those, I'd like to invite you to make a short opening statement.
Many thanks, Convener. Good morning, Committee. I am presenting my performance audit report this morning on fiscal sustainability and reform in Scotland. The audit focuses on the Scottish Government's overall approach to achieving fiscal sustainability and the important role of public service reform as a key component of that approach. As the committee will know, the 25-26 draft Scottish budget was announced yesterday in the Parliamentary Chamber. We're not in a position at this stage to comment on how the budget impacts on my report, and we will return to this over the course of our work programme in future. But I might perhaps just note 2 or 3 items of interest that are perhaps relevant to this morning's discussion. 2 things. Firstly, Convener, that were accompanied the budget were the publication of a tax strategy and public sector pay policy. These are both welcome announcements, and they give clarity to public bodies and a sense of the government's intention around tax as a component of fiscal sustainability. The committee will be aware that each year I publish an assurance report on the Scottish rate of income tax that will be relevant to the tax strategy, and we'll be publishing that on the 17th of January, along with the usual National Audit Office report on the management of the Scottish rate of income tax. We look forward to briefing the committee on that in the new year. The other point, perhaps pausing for a moment in terms of the budget, that is also relevant to today's report is the Cabinet Secretary's announcement of a Spend to Save fund of £30 million to support public service reform. Clearly, we don't have the detail of that yet, and we look forward to seeing more of that and what that means for the government's approach to delivering its public service reform ambitions. Convener, my evidence to the committee over in the last few weeks on the 2023-24 audit of the Scottish Government's consolidated accounts set out how the Scottish Government continues to face an intensely challenging period in managing its finances. Today's report comments further on how the Scottish Government is responding to that challenge, including my views on how well reform is factored into its medium and long-term approach. I highlight the following areas. We note that the Scottish Government continues to take short-term budget decisions, more typically reacting to events during the year than making more fundamental changes as to how public money is spent. This approach successfully balances the budget, but it risks disrupting services and progress towards better longer-term outcomes for the people of Scotland. The Scottish Government has also not yet set out a clear vision of how it will change the delivery of public services to make them more financially sustainable into the longer term. The Scottish Government is clear that reform is needed, and I think you heard more of that in yesterday's budget speech, but has not yet shown how it will reform and how those reforms will contribute to making future budgets affordable, how much it will cost to implement, and when reforms at scale will be delivered. We note that more leadership is needed to better support public bodies in delivering a comprehensive, deliverable programme of reform. Lastly, Convener, a key finding from this audit is that the Scottish Government has not yet been clear enough with the Scottish Parliament or the public on the fiscal position. Key documents have been delayed, making scrutiny of the current uncertain financial situation more difficult. The Scottish Government has committed to producing a number of strategies and plans next year, including a new fiscal sustainability delivery plan. I recommend, as you'll see in the report, that these should be published at the earliest opportunity. While these will not be in time necessarily to support the scrutiny of the current budget, I would expect them to be available well in advance of next year's budget cycle and to include better data and commentary on reform that I make recommendations to in this report. Convener, as ever, my colleagues and I look forward to answering the committee's questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that opening statement, and thank you for touching on yesterday's budget. I'm going to invite Graham Simpson to put some questions to you now, and he may well start with yesterday's budget. So,
well,
Graham.
I may well, Convener. Seems appropriate to do so. And I'm not asking you, of course, to comment on what you think of individual announcements in the budget, but just overall, and I know you've made some opening remarks, but overall, do you think that what you heard yesterday goes in any way towards addressing the concerns that you've raised in this report?
So I suppose maybe if it's helpful for me to put on the record that but the boundaries of my role, and firstly is that you're right, it's not for me to comment in any way on the merits of individual policies. I think, as I've maybe touched on in my opening remarks, Mr Simpson, that and is reflected in today's report, is that until we see an updated medium-term financial strategy accompanied with longer-term plans for capital investment, a plan for day-to-day spending and investment within the NHS, which, as the committee will be familiar, accounts for 40% and growing of Scotland's budget. I don't think we're in a position to say that yesterday's developments materially change the need for more transparency on Scotland's fiscal position. As I mentioned to the convener, that we did hear an announcement yesterday on the of a spend to save fund to support fiscal public service reform. The detail of that will be really important as to how that aligns with the development, as we call for in today's report, of a clear long-term strategy that delivers public service reform at scale. So there are a number of opportunities that will come absolutely clearly for the committee and the Parliament over the next few weeks, and for others to get into some of the detail of the budget, and we'll be doing likewise. But I suppose those are my headlines from yesterday. Okay.
So you mentioned that medium-term financial strategy. When would you expect to see that?
I think our language around it is that we would expect to see that at the earliest opportunity. We understand that the government's intention around it is to wait for the completion of the UK government spending review before completing its medium-term financial strategy and capital pipeline, infrastructure investment pipeline. Timing-wise, and colleagues can keep me right, maybe Richard might be more detail on this. I think it's the spring that the UK government of next year has intended, and sometimes seasons when they just don't always give you, precise months as to when you can expect that. And that's not an unreasonable approach, I would say. I think that this UK spending review will be very important to give up-to-date information on the medium-term financial strategy. And as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, and before passing to Richard, these won't be available for the Parliament's scrutiny of this year's budget to get a sense as to what the longer-term implications are. Ever more important, therefore, that they are available before get into what will be the 26-27 budget considerations, Mr Simpson. But if you're content, I'll maybe bring Richard in and say a bit more on that.
Thank you very much, Lord General. So it will be up to the Scottish Government as to when exactly they choose to bring this out. As the Auditor General points out, with the spending review coming in 2025, that is likely to give the Scottish Government more information it needs around what the broader UK spending and funding plans are. That's not to say that the Scottish Government needs to wait until then. It's just that those would be the benefits of doing so. Currently, it's down for spring, although there have been conversations in the press about that maybe going into the summer. So one of the things the Scottish Government will need to consider is what's the best timing for them to bring out what their medium-term plans are. probably the final thing to say is that there's also a commitment which the Cabinet Secretary has made, which was referred to in the report, around a financial sustainability plan. So as well as thinking about what the medium-term strategy will look like, you know, what do the scenarios look like, how would the Scottish Government respond to each of those scenarios, there's also an opportunity to think about how they might want to align their financial sustainability plans in the best way to those spending. So it's up to them, but there's a few things for them to factor into the consideration.
Right, so already we can see that the medium-term financial strategy might not arrive till sort of later next year, even.
I think so Richard mentions the indications are subject to the completion of the process. That will be the spring. We don't have any more detail of that.
Okay. And when, I mean, it's called medium term, so what sort of period would you expect that to cover?
So I guess there's two parts to that, and you know, be for the Scottish Government to set out how long it wants the duration of that. Richard might want to say a bit more about the how previous iterations are, you know, whether it's 3, 5 years, and of course the further you go out, the less reliable forecasts become. But I think, notwithstanding whether a medium-term financial strategy is developed, it doesn't mean that any organisation, whether it's the Scottish Government, a commercial entity, or a small public sector body, should always be doing scenario planning on iterations of, you know, how income and spending might be being delivered. But I think, Richard, you might have more insight as to the mechanics of how the strategy might be developed.
Yeah, normally it's 3 to 5 years. The process for the medium-term strategy, because there's been a few iterations over time of what exactly they'll look like, and we've commented on those, and previous Auditor Generals has commented on those in the past as well. What it's an opportunity to do is set out the best information that you have about what the medium-term, the 3 to 5 year picture looks like, understanding, as the Auditor General says, that the further you get away in time, the more events could happen, and therefore the more prepared you have to be to react to those changes. And why it's important is it allows the Scottish Government to set out how it would respond to change in a proactive and responsive way. So some of the findings in the report here are around the need for reactive in-ear responses and a lack of clarity or transparency about what the impact of changes are on, say, outcomes and priorities. The medium-term strategy is an opportunity to think about those things in advance and therefore plan as to how you would react to, say, increases as well as decreases in funding. Is as much as about being shovel ready for new projects as it is knowing where you can flex the budget if times are harder. So it's a key strategic document that allows you to consider almost a path towards a medium-term financial sustainable position and your longer-term joined-up priorities and cross-cutting areas of government.
Okay, I'm just sort of thinking this through. Given the sort of timescales, we'll be getting fairly close to the next Scottish Parliament elections, where there could be a change of government. So they might have a difference. The next government could have a different strategy. So is there a risk there, by leaving it so late, if I can describe it that way, that strategy could actually be overtaken by the election? You know, we might have to produce a new one. So,
you know, it will be for the government of the day to determine its approach to fiscal sustainability and transparency reporting. I think, from our perspective, perhaps it ought to be a feature really of effective financial planning, supporting parliamentary scrutiny, transparency, really regardless of the budget. You may be seeing in the report, Mr Simpson, that we make reference to opportunities as the Scottish Government develops its financial forecasting and reporting arrangements to draw on the experience of other jurisdictions. For example, the event, how the Welsh Parliament, the Welsh Government undertakes forecasting and reporting is a feature that the Scottish Government may wish to adopt.
But sorry, could you describe that?
Yeah, I'll bring colleagues in actually with this part of the analysis that we did. We might want to Fiona might want to cover, just to say a bit more about some of the documents and strategies that Wales and elsewhere have used, and just a chance for, in this period before the creation of the next medium-term financial strategy, just for the Scottish Government to cast its eye more broadly. But Fiona can set that out for the committee.
Thank you, Auditor General. As part of our review, we were particularly interested in the way that the Welsh Government assesses the impact of its budget on different groups. In 24-25, for the 2024-25 budget, the Welsh Government published a strategic integrated impact assessment, which looked at where spending had been reduced, or the way they'd chosen to reprioritise spending, the impact this might have on different groups. We thought that was a useful and positive development.
Okay, so maybe something we could look at here. Auditor General, you're very critical, and I think you have been for some time, about the kind of short-term nature of budgetary decisions here in Scotland. Do you think this? I mean, I know you've said earlier that means we balance the budget because we've got to balance the budget every year. But is that approach fit for purpose in your view?
So there's a couple of things. You're right. So the Scottish Government has successfully balanced its budget each year, and I wouldn't want to underplay that, Mr. Simpson. This is with the mechanics of the fiscal framework, the Scottish Government's ability to carry forward monies from one year to the next within the confines of the fiscal framework. It's a £50 billion plus spending operation, and they deliver balanced budget within those confines, and have received, as the committee will know through the reporting on Scottish Government accounts, a clean audit opinion on that reporting. That is of significance. But to do that, as we set out in today's report and in the report on Scottish Government accounts, they are relying upon, in recent years, short-term interventions. So, in our view, a couple of factors, and perhaps bring Carol in to say a bit more about what we've seen through the audit of the government, is that the Scottish Government doesn't have a clear enough understanding of its cost base. So, as part of that scenario planning we discussed, when it has to adopt an emergency budget approach or interventions, it's not an easy scenario that they can pull down to say this is where they will target and what the impact of those decisions have on people who might be using that part of public service. So we think there's a gap here in that approach that, whilst it might meet that base requirement to deliver the budget, it's not an optimal approach. And bring Carol in perhaps just to kind of set out what that means in practice and where I think we'd like the government to get to have a more rounded approach. Carol.
Thank you, Auditor General. As the Auditor General has said, when we've spoke about this in previous sessions, the short-term nature of the decision-making, we can't see how that is prioritising certain areas. From what we can see, each of the portfolios are asked to look for areas where spend could be pushed out into future years, where there could be savings. It's unclear the consideration that's given to the priorities that impact on outcomes, and also what it is doing is moving pressures from the current year into future years. So it's not taking that slightly longer term approach that we're looking for here. And as the Auditor General has said, being clear at the start of where you can flex your budget, where you can take the opportunities out and move them forward with the minimal impact on outcomes.
Okay. I mean, just going back to the budget, did that feel to you? Because it felt to me like there were a lot of short-term announcements yesterday, and not really too many long-term, which is what you're looking for, really. Is that how it felt to you?
So I think to have clarity in the longer-term position, we're still referring to the government's last medium-term financial strategy, which was the spring-summer of 2023. Clearly, lots of events have happened since then that will influence the reliability of those forecasts. And even perhaps more recent events, Mr. Simpson. So in today's report, for example, we referred to the emergency budget of over the past few months. the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government's intention back then was to use ScotWind monies to support fiscal balance and, and implications of public sector pay and so forth. Yesterday, the Cabinet Secretary was clear that that wouldn't now be required to support financial balance in the current year, but that those monies, not the entirety of the ScotWind monies, but the additional monies that were intended to be used this year, 360 million, I think, if I've got that figure correct, thank you, would now be carried forward to be used as part of capital programmes in the 25-26 budget. So there are a lot of moving parts, but I think probably reiterating the point that until the annual budget is accompanied by clear scenarios, medium-term financial strategies, we have a gap.
Yeah, okay. I've just got a couple more questions. First one is, in Exhibit 1, which is a graph, really, and it shows a growing gap between spending and projected funding. So that's getting bigger. That's getting bigger. Do you see that situation just getting worse and worse? Do you see any action from the government that would address that problem? Because it is a problem.
So there is a gap. So I think as we set out at paragraph 11 that, and this again is based on the most recent forecast going back to 2023. So we don't have the, even notwithstanding yesterday's budget announcement, I think still unclear as to the extent of how the projected financial gap, whether that will change in light of this. I suspect it will, but we don't know whether it's positive or negative impact on it. And it's really that, whilst the government is required to manage its budget on a 12-month basis, I think as one of the key points in today's report, it's becoming harder and harder to do that, as we've seen in recent times. The other variable that is part of the mix now is additional monies have come to Scotland as a result of the UK budget over the past few months. And while we've seen projected balanced budget for 25-26 yesterday, we don't know what happens beyond then. So I think it will be, as I say, the publication of the medium-term financial strategy in the spring of next year before we have clarity about what the impact of these decisions will be beyond 12 months from now.
Okay. My last question, one of your recommendations is about mandate letters. And you say that by September next year, the government should review and update the mandate letters it issued in September 2023. I just wonder if you could explain what mandate letters are, why you think they're important, and whether the mandate letters issued in September 2023 had any effect whatsoever.
Yeah, certainly. I can set out, I suppose, the context of the recommendation and bring colleagues in to say a bit more about what was intended and what the substance of our recommendation. These, Mr Simpson, the committee may recall, were issued by the former First Minister to Cabinet Secretaries as part of really a clarity of intent from public spending and the delivery of portfolio intentions. Part of really a kind of long-running thread, as it were, of that there's a clearer connection between public spending and outcomes. We, together with various strategies and the updated programme for government, the mandate letters were government's attempts, and the better place to explain this themselves perhaps, to give that clarity of thread between spending and intended outcomes. As events develop, what was set out in the winter of 2023 evolves. We have change of political leadership, and also events may have overtaken them. So I think the point we're looking to make is that the content of those become less relevant as you go further. So is it the government's intention to restate these, continue to use these, or use an alternative mechanism to have clarity of outcomes from spending? But I'll bring Richard in, as he may want to develop that a bit further.
So absolutely, that's right. The sense of being able to maintain that thread from the strategies, the programme to government, to the actual decisions that were made within portfolios was aided by having mandate letters in place, which is why we're calling in our recommendations for either that to be replicated or for an alternative means which has the same information in it. And at paragraph 85 of the report, we kind of detail it out a little bit more, that it came with the programme for government, that it was about each of those portfolios setting out the aims of the government, the objectives of the portfolios and the priorities for the parliamentary term. So why that's useful is because during a year, a lot of decisions around spending and managing budgets will take place within portfolios. This means that there's an opportunity for each portfolio to be clear on how it should prioritise the decisions that it's making during the year. The other benefit of something of that ilk is to allow a clearer understanding of the cross-cutting nature of the work that portfolios does. So we talk in the report about the fact that many of the objectives that the Scottish Government wants to achieve, such as addressing poverty or climate change, are going to rely on a number of different areas of government working together. Having something that more systematically sets out how each portfolio is contributing to that will aid a better understanding of how they can work together.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I think in particular the public accountability nature of it. So quite often the government will have mechanisms, internally that they'll, use to do that, but with the mandate letters, it was that public commitment, and people could see and hold to account in terms of the deliverability.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. And I think we may return to that theme a little bit later on. But we've now got some questions which Colin Beattie wants to put to you. So I'll hand over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Convener. Unsurprisingly, I'm going to talk more about the budget. Page 12, paragraph 24, highlights the timing of the UK budgetary information as one of the pressures that the Scottish Government has to deal with. And your report details or states, the funding that the Scottish Government receives from the UK Government is not finalised until near the end of the financial year, once the UK supplementary estimates are known, usually in February, which, given the timing with the Scottish Government, is difficult. And that means the Scottish Government's got to manage potential impacts of changes, even at the last minute, to its funding, basically throughout the entirety of the financial year. The last UK Government spending review is in 2021. That means it's not clear what funding the Scottish Government will receive after 25-26. Now, that's obviously impacting on the ability of the Scottish Government to plan its budgets. I mean, we're urging it to plan its budget several years in advance. This virtually prevents it from doing so. So, how does the timing of the UK budget and the spending review impact on the Scottish Government's ability to plan its budgets? What steps could the Scottish Government take within the powers available to it to mitigate this particular pressure?
Good morning, Mr. Beattie. I'll start actually, and I'll pass to Richard, but maybe just say about the mechanics of how this operates in terms of the flow of information and funds between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. I'd maybe say two things. First of all, as we set out, it is a pressure and it's a key variable that the Scottish Government has to deal with in terms of firstly the precise clarity of funding that it gets from the UK budget. As some of us are consequence of Barnett consequentialists, and the committee I know are well versed in this, that can be both a positive and negative transaction in terms of the flow of funds between the Scottish and UK Government. One of which this committee may want to come on to is the UK Government's decision, for example, around winter heating. That money is currently sitting within the Scottish Government's budget, £160 million or so. But because of the decision that the UK Government has made in terms of its application of winter heating, that money, in theory, would be a negative Barnett consequential. And that's the decision that the Scottish Government can make over the course of the year. The wider point I would make before bringing in Richard, Mr. Beattie, is that it's undoubtedly a variable and a pressure. But I think in our view, were there a clear, published medium-term financial strategy with the various scenarios at play, none of those would necessarily be perfect, but it would give the Scottish Government and Parliament and the public a clearer understanding of how they can interpret and apply some of these changes in variables to the application of its own financial position. You also asked about the spending review. Clearly, that's material. So that there hasn't been a UK government spending review for over 3 years, and we'll know the results will be 4 years by the time, is relevant for the Scottish Government's ability to have a reliable medium-term financial strategy and a central forecast that they can anticipate what their income and spending is likely to be. So I think it's a reasonable position that the Scottish Government has adopted, that it intends to wait, given the proximity of the next spending review, before it updates its next medium-term financial strategy. But we are clear that that needs to be available as soon as possible to support parliamentary scrutiny, particularly the next budget cycle.
But doesn't this mean that for the Scottish Government, I mean, doing any sort of planning beyond the current year is just opening them up to all sorts of variables that are going to come from the UK government, and they'll be chopping and changing their budget all the time? I mean, the number of changes that have come out of Westminster have been fairly frequent and fairly sweeping, some of them. And if the Scottish Government's done its projections, hopefully into the medium term, it's just a nonsense.
So I don't think it's an either or. I think that you still require a medium-term financial strategy. Otherwise, you'd be so as a scenario, the publication of the medium-term financial strategy in the spring of next year will have the most up-to-date information available because of its proximity to what we can expect to be a conclusion of the UK government spending review. I don't think it would be a reasonable position to wait, for the next spending review that follows, if that's a 4-year period, if it mirrors this approach. I think that has to be done on a rolling, iterative basis of a medium-term financial strategy. As I was mentioned, it might not be perfect, but it will perhaps be the best available evidence to support longer-term decisions about tax and spending and public services that inform those approaches to deliver fiscal balance. Because even as Mr Simpson referenced, there's a potential gap of nearly £2 billion between income and spending projections over the course of the next few years. A medium-term financial strategy will help planning, help prioritisation and scrutiny. So I think it's both those things are relevant and necessary to deliver, perhaps not an entirely accurate set of forecasts, but maybe the best available evidence that's available. Richard might want to say a bit more. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think part of this question is around how can the Scottish Government manage the risks and uncertainty that it faces through the budgets. And undoubtedly, as you point out, UK funding and fluctuations in the UK funding are one of those risks that the Scottish Government has to manage. So we set out in Exhibit 2 of the report quite clearly some of those UK fiscal environment risks that the Scottish Government must manage alongside its own. So what are the things that help? So as the Auditor General says, MTFS gives an opportunity to set scenarios about how you would respond to increases or decreases in funding. That might include changes in taxes that you're expecting through as well, which can also fluctuate, must be managed by the Scottish Government, and the same with spending being higher or lower. I think in terms of some of the specifics, so there are, and you mentioned around the end-of-year funding situation and how to react to that. So the fiscal framework does give some provisions for those things, such as reserves and how the Scottish Government sets its reserves policy to move money between years, if that's the case, or use money from reserves, as well as some of its borrowing powers that it would have in relation to other things, such as forecasting risk of outturns of taxes. This is why we also raise around the importance of the flex in the budget. So that kind of close eye that is needed on the Scottish Government budget and the communication that's required with UK Government around those end-year positions. There's also been some occasions where money, where it's been very, very late received. We're talking into March, additional money received, that it has been carried from one year to the other outside of the budget. We've referred to that in our previous operation of the fiscal frameworks papers. The overall point is it's how the Scottish Government understands the variety of its risk management options, which will go from everything from its medium-term understanding to how it's going to use the powers in its fiscal framework, to what it understands about its cost basis, budgets and its big-ticket items, if you will, which we refer to in the report as things like pay, for example.
Okay. Well, maybe we can move on a little bit there. I mean, paragraphs 28, 29, page 13, it says, during the process of developing the 24-25 Scottish budget, no portfolio accountable officer was able to provide assurance that they'd be able to fund their existing commitments with the initial allocations provided to them. Now, subsequently, they eventually were able to provide these assurances when funding was finalised, and after identifying savings, of course, and reprioritising spending and so forth. But what does this actually mean? What's your assessment of the impact on public services of this prolonged funding uncertainty and in-year budget changes?
So I think this feels quite stark, actually, that the circumstances reflect a very tight fiscal position. And some of these discussions took place before the UK budget that would have been a significant factor in easing some of the stretch that was anticipated to be in the Scottish budget. Carol can say a bit more about, at the moment, some of the insight that she'll have from leading our audit of the Scottish Government. But at paragraph 28, with no portfolio accountable officers able to provide assurance, and the committee will be well versed on what happens if an accountable officer is unable to offer assurances in terms of the regularity of expenditure, considerations of requests for written authority or ministerial directions to proceed in the event that there would be significant risks to balancing the budget. Inevitably, there's a degree of iteration. If an accountable officer is unable to offer ministers that level of assurance, you can see that to and fro that can happen. I think what it spells out, Mr. Beattie, is just the extent of stretch, challenging decisions, risks that there were to the government's ability to deliver a balanced budget. Of course, and Carol can say more about this was a period in time, and events do evolve, whether it's the UK budget or the Scottish, the finalisation of the Scottish budget too. But what I think perhaps just before past, Carol, it sets out that the affordability of spending plans was compromised when these were initially produced. And at the risk of labouring the point, had there been a more up-to-date medium-term financial strategy, it might have helped a wider understanding of some of those decisions and where the flex in the budget would be to help inform some of those choices. But Carol can say a bit more about the insight that we have to that.
Thank you, Auditor General. So, as you point out in paragraph 28, we say that no portfolio accountable officer was able to provide assurance at the initial budget position. It's not unsurprising that within those discussions, the negotiations, that people would be looking for investment in certain areas. But I think what's quite stark is that no accountable officer was able to do it. I think it comes back to the point about prioritisation. And you would perhaps have expected there to be areas where the budget was sufficient based on their contribution to outcomes and the priorities of the government. But that wasn't the case. So each area had to identify savings to enable to achieve the balanced position.
Certainly, I would agree that it's quite startling that it was right across the board. And from what you're saying here, it was every accountable officer. Just looking again at your report, and carrying on from that, you noted that the financial pressures are already impacting the quality or level of services and affecting the long-term objectives of the Scottish Government. And it highlights that the long-term impact of reductions in spending have not been consistently and publicly set out, which restricts the Scottish Parliament's ability to understand and scrutinise the budget. Paragraph 31, page 13, further states it's not clear how activity to reform services and the savings and costs involved is taken into account when making decisions on the budget. What types of information would you expect to see in the forthcoming budget yesterday? And was that missing from the budget? And how should it be set out? How should it be properly set out?
Yes, thank you for that.
I realise, General, you haven't had a chance to scrutinise the budget in detail yet, but...
Well, thank you for saying that, Mr. Beattie. Actually, I suppose just to kind of manage expectations, and clearly with the committee and many others, we will be doing that in detail. To make of all the various budget documents, and then clearly it's a draft budget at the moment. So as it progresses through Parliament over the course of the next few weeks, we'll continue to track our understanding of what that means, and sometimes what's included in the detail that might not be initially apparent. So we need to go through all of that process. I'm going to bring Fiona in a second, actually, just about our kind of wider thoughts on the clarity of public spending and public service reform intentions, which, if I picked up, I think is kind of the heart of your question about how the government is setting out perhaps a clearer direction of travel than we've seen thus far in terms of reforming public services so that they are sustainable. There's a clearer connection to outcomes. I think, as we touched on also in the report, about the government's intention to be clearer in the national performance framework and the national outcomes, which will be again be a central part of sustainable public finances, and when what spending is delivering for outcomes. There's clarity around the affordability of public services and public service reform in the round. Maybe one point before I bring Fiona in is that there are many good examples of public service reform, Mr. Beattie. We can get into some of them as the committee wishes. I think what we haven't seen is a clear enough strategy or approach that maps out how the government plans to move from its current model of public service delivery. And I think we've heard Cabinet Secretaries over the past few days reiterate their intention to reform public services, but to now see a clear plan that maps from where we are today in terms of our models to one of clarity in terms of outcomes and public service. So we'll be examining the budget documents very closely and to see how that maps to our recommendations, whether that comes through in these papers or over the course of the next few months. But Fiona, I'll turn to you.
Thank you. I think in terms of the information that Parliament and the public have received in terms of reform, there's been 2 updates to the Finance and Public Administration Committee, the most recent in September 2024, and this is setting out the approach and the objectives of reform. In our review, we can see the plans. I think what we felt was missing was around the timelines for and costs for reform. And the Auditor General set out a recommendation that for the next update to on public service reform, this would set out more about how reform will contribute to the objective of fiscally sustainable public services, a commentary on the cost involved, and some clear milestones and timescales for delivery, as well as the likely impact on people as well.
Okay. I suppose lack of information seems to be a common theme right through the whole budget process. If you're like, we're not seeing the workings, how it's arrived at, how the answers are arrived at in terms of budget allocations and so on. How should this be set out? I mean, we know we know from what you're saying that there's information missing. How would you expect that to be set out in a budget? So, without referring to yesterday.
Well, quite. So, as we say, we will do that analysis, mindful that this committee and the various committees across the Parliament will have the opportunity to go through their pre-budget and post-budget scrutiny process to support their understanding. Fiona and Richard both might want to comment on this, actually, but in terms of moving beyond the in-year budget, clearly the Parliament and the public will want to have clarity of understanding beneath the numbers in the in-year budget. But I don't think you can make a fully informed decision about a budget and its implications without casting your eye slightly further forward with reliable information. So what my view would inevitably help if it was accompanied by an up-to-date medium-term financial strategy, clarity around the intent for capital spending of the infrastructure investment pipeline plan that is anticipated to be updated alongside the medium-term financial strategy. Touched on National Health Service, that it too requires an updated medium-term revenue spending programme for the National Health Service. So I think these documents, whilst might feel quite dry, and there's a number of them in terms of plans and strategy, I think they are integral to a wider understanding and scrutiny of public spending that goes beyond the budget document itself, Mr. Beattie. Again, I'll turn to Richard and maybe then Fiona just to kind of, if there's anything further they want to add.
Thank you, General. So if I may be so bold as to slightly reset the question as what information would be useful for scrutiny, because I think that that's at the core of what you'd expect in terms of any documentation around what's happening in a financial year and what's happening between them. So I think from our point of view, for what we've found when we've been looking at the in-year movements on budgets, is more information around, and Fiona has referred to the Welsh example, for example, more information about what the impact of changes on people is going to be. That would aid scrutiny of the decisions that have been reached during a year for yourselves and for the Finances and the Public Administration Committee, for example, and a sense of how the priorities together are being considered would also be useful with in-year documentation. Moving on to the medium-term position, and also considering why that's important to reform, is that, as was referred to earlier in our exhibit, which comes from the medium-term financial strategy from 2023 with the 3 lines of scenarios and showing that that's an issue, there's something about working out what is the gap that needs to be closed over the medium term. What is the size of the gap and what is the sufficiency? How much work does reform have to do? So how much of that gap will be made up by reform as opposed to, say, reducing services or increasing taxes or the other types of levers that the Scottish Government might have. So within that, it's about understanding what how much reform will cost to do, how much it will return in terms of savings and efficiencies, how long it will take to accomplish. Some reform may take several years, some of it you may be able to do within a couple of years, for example. And then again, going back to that, what's the impact on people? So how is that going to be mapped out? And we mentioned in the report in the third part around some of the monitoring frameworks that can develop around equalities and human rights and people who might be particularly affected by decisions and reform.
Maybe just by way of example, if it helps. So we mentioned that, and the committee will have heard just to the Cabinet Secretary's intention that there'd be a £30 million spent to save fund to support public service reform. I guess what is unclear is that a one-off? Is there going to be more money next year or the following year? Because public service reform will have to be a rolling programme as we make recommendations of clear milestones, what its outcomes and intentions are going to be. Had it been accompanied by a medium-term financial strategy that set that out, I think it would aid scrutiny and parliamentary decision-making. So whilst on the one hand, you can see, as you referenced, what public bodies have told us, that one of the barriers to effective public service reform was the absence of a change fund. So I'm sure that they will welcome that. But I think what maybe is less clear is that enough, and what it's going to be used, and and how that connects to a medium-term programme of spending to support reform.
Okay, one last question here. Your report on paragraph 32 refers to the Scottish Government making regular large in-year changes to its budget to break even. And you're making similar points as the Finance and Public Administration Committee, who published a report on 7th of November this year, stating there is little evidence that medium and long-term financial planning is taking place, and year-on-year budgeting has also become challenging, with significant emergency controls being required in each of the last 3 years. So I guess what I would ask you is, are emergency controls becoming the new normal? Is this now adopted as the way forward? And how sustainable is the regular use of in-year changes to address budgetary pressures? And what are the risks?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's perhaps too soon to say that this is an established pattern, that we'll forever be in a cycle of interventions that sees the Scottish Government having to adopt an emergency approach, but that we've had 2 significant interventions in the past 3 years suggests that there's an emerging pattern. I'll maybe set it a bit more in the risk, and colleagues, feel free to contribute to this, is that, as we say in the report, the Scottish Government doesn't have a clear enough understanding of its cost base that it knows where to go to in the event that there is significant intervention required. The causes of that will inform whether these are inflationary or changes to its budget beyond its control. What it's tended to do is to target those, and we set out some of the examples in Exhibit 4, Mr Beattie, of where the Scottish Government has approached particular lines of spending to balance the budget. We've touched on ScotWind as an example that seemed at odds with the original intention of ScotWind to be more around climate biodiversity orientated. Instead, it was a significant contributor to supporting public sector pay deals. So I don't know if that quite leads us to a point, say, that there's an inevitability that there will always be an intervention required in terms of emergency spending controls. It's clearly suboptimal. And one of the paths out of this approach is to have, firstly, a better understanding of the cost base. Have that as part of your scenario. So if there is a financial challenge, the Scottish Government and the Parliament will clearly know which budget line is going to be approached and what the implications of that are. So I think, as we set out in the report, one of the factors that we were unclear of is whether the Government had a strong enough understanding of the implications on outcomes, equalities implications more widely on stopping spending on a particular budget line. These tend to be done on a portfolio basis as opposed to a more cross-cutting assessment of spending implications. The last thing I would say, to bring Richard in first of all, is a stronger path out of this will have more detailed scenarios, medium-term strategies across the piece that the Government can draw down as they need to. I think Richard might want to say further.
I might bring in Fiona in a minute, if that's okay, just about the fiscal risk arrangements side of things that we cover in the report. I think it's fair to say it's been a disruptive number of years over the last few years, hasn't it? With COVID-19, and we've reported on the fact that there are a large number of movements happening there, and we've also reported on the cost of living that followed. That is in the inflationary pressures and then the knock-on effects of that to reform. So I think what it highlights is the importance of planning, the importance of knowing the levers and the abilities that exist to be able to respond rather than react to events. One of the things is learning the lessons from things that have worked in the past. So we mentioned about the mandate letters. There's things that have worked which were worth considering continuing, but also keeping that focus on what the level of the fiscal risk is that remains. So I may just hand over to you if that's okay, because we do touch on that in the report.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Richard. In paragraphs 53 and 54, we talk a little bit about the risk management that the Scottish Government has undertaken and highlight that I think the Scottish Government has a kind of clear assessment of the risks to fiscal sustainability. However, the corporate risk registers continue to identify risks of fiscal sustainability and score them highly, and that's not moving over time.
Can I ask you a daft laddie question? You talk about the Scottish Government not understanding its cost base. We know what we spend the money on. What exactly do you mean by not understanding the cost base?
Carol's probably best placed to set that out clearly.
So I think what we're looking at here is, I suppose, what you're getting for the money. So what is the cost base delivering? And therefore, where are there opportunities within that for efficiencies to be driven out that can then inform future decision making? Good data is so key to so much of the government, but also across the Scottish public sector. And I know it's something the committee has explored on a number of occasions about the lack of good data to inform decision making. And I think that's what we're touching on here, is just that deeper understanding of the data that sits underneath it. What does that tell you about the public services that are being delivered at that cost? Where are the efficiencies that could come from that? Where should reform be focused on that, so that we get the same or better outcomes in the future at a lower cost base?
But you would hope that the people running these areas would have a good knowledge of their cost base when the pressure comes to save money and so on. I think the Scottish Government itself sort of operates at that level.
Yeah.
It's the people in the trenches that are delivering these services and should be able to make these assessments.
It's perhaps go back. I heard a couple of things. I mentioned one already. Is about you'll be familiar with the structure of the budget. It tends to be on a portfolio basis. So inevitably, I think there's a cascade down to where, as we mentioned about, I suppose, the budget setting process, about portfolios are asked to identify savings. So even before the budget setting, so when you're in the budget in the midst of a year and asked to make savings, it's portfolios will be asked to say, well, where can we make savings? But there might need to be a broader understanding that is about not just on individual portfolios, but across the piece on different types of spending, so both up and down and across, as it were. The other factor that makes it more challenging is so much of the Scottish budget is consumed by pay costs and then or allocations to local government that are hard to. So when you take those out, to say, well, where can flex it, and whether it's allocations or grants, and it's that level of challenge that I think has brought some very tough decisions. Inevitably, it will be tough any year if you have to make emergency interventions and spending controls. But having a more ready-made plan will make that a more seamless process.
Okay, thank you, Vera.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to press straight on and invite the Deputy Convener to put some questions to you. Jamie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Auditor General. Good morning to our guests. I'm very surprised you weren't up all night studying the budget, like everyone else was. So I guess what I want to touch on is, yes, there was a draft budget announced yesterday, but in the context of your report and some of the wider issues that you've been talking about for the last few months around the financial sustainability of public spending relative to revenue. So I will reflect on some of what happened yesterday, but in that context rather than the specifics of the policy. I hope that's helpful. One of the things I've struggled with, I guess, over the last 24 hours since the budget announcement is digging below the headlines. You'll see there's a lot of media reporting around cash spend increases and promises to spend more in specific portfolios. But one thing that's particularly unclear is where that money is coming from. And I think that's an issue that you raise in your report, is the transparency issue around this. How do we, as a committee, how do parliamentarians, how do the public get to the detail on this? How do we know where this additional money is coming from? Because I don't.
So there's a lot in that, in terms of the basis of information, and that will be supported by the budget documents, committee scrutiny, the advice of the Scottish Parliament Information Centre and others, that analysis to support clarity for decision makers about the various strands of where the revenue is coming, the tax forecasts, block grant funding from the UK government. So I don't think I doubt that there's the numbers add up. I think that they will. I think that the forecasts will be reliable. You'll be supported by the Scottish Fiscal Commission's assessments as well to give you a rounded picture of the source of funding. And fundamentally, there really only are two sources. Whether it's tax forecasts and block grant funding from the UK government as the basis for public spending in Scotland. What I think is still the gap, Deputy Convener, is, and then what happens because thereafter the 12 months, because spending continues. Public sector pay is a huge factor. People are employed. We know that public service reform still needs to be a key component of that, but it's that lack of clarity beyond the 12-month process that is central to the decisions that have to be made this year is still that gap. So whilst I think you'll have reliable information to make an assessment on this year's budget, I don't think it gives you enough of a picture about what then happens thereafter.
I think that's the point, though, is that you talked about the two areas where you can get additional money, and that's either via block grant, which presumably is either money that's already been pre-promised from the UK government through top-up funding from the UK budget or consequentials due to decisions made in Westminster, or block grant asks of the government, which are not guaranteed. The two are very different. Alongside that sits revenue projections from tax intake under devolved taxation. But I guess if neither of those increase, or there's not a likelihood of those increasing, for example, early projections show that the tax increases announcing from these decisions are less than 100 million, so it's nominal, nowhere near enough to scratch the surface of the spending commitments, the cash spend commitments. So in that sense, would the only other option be for, if portfolio increases happen in one area, then surely that requires cuts in other areas. So in other words, to balance the books, the money has just been shuffled around from one set of portfolios to another. So you either have new money or you're just shuffling around existing money. And it's very hard to determine which is it. And I guess that's what I'm struggling with.
So I recognise that. I think even some of the early analysis that we have done the budgets, that there are movements. So there are real terms increases for National Health Service, or as indicated in the draft budget, and also anticipated growth in social security spending. The members across the Parliament will have heard about the intention to support winter heating payments, and these will have financial implications. I think what is looking to see is, and then what the position will be during the course of the year if funding doesn't arrive. We'll go back to talk about the scenarios that will be necessary, but hopefully avoided. There's sufficient clarity to support reliability of the forecasts in advance of settling on the budget before the new financial year. So I think there's a degree of uncertainty about what might happen as we move over the course of the year. And as we touched on in an earlier discussion this morning, the UK spending review will be a key part of that clarity.
Just to throw a spanner in the works, some of the early analysis that came out of yesterday, I think, paints towards a bigger picture around how we get our head around the transparency issue when ministers make announcements on new money. And I was particularly struck by the summary from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. I'm not sure if you've read that yet, but it left me with more questions than answers. And just to summarise briefly for the benefit of others, it paints a picture that announcements made on paper, which is backed up, by the way, by the SPICE graphics that came out this morning, suggest around a 5% cash terms increase, or 2.9 after inflation, so real terms. However, and this is the key, it excludes £1.3 billion of funding. That budget documentation implies that the Scottish Government still has to allocate to services this year. And if that was to take it into account, then actually you're looking at a flat cash settlement next year. Now, where do I start with this? So there's either 5% cash increase or there isn't. I'm of the understanding that the government is unable to roll over money year on year. So how can unallocated money this year be spent in next year's budget, for example? So again, these all just raise questions about the veracity of some of the top-line figures that people are seeing in the newspapers this morning. And this is what I think it's important. We need to dig under. I wonder if you had any views on that.
So you're right. So it's clearly, forgive me if I've been trite, but clearly there's a lot of complexity, and and it will be eased, I hope, through some of the committee scrutiny, this committee and others across the Parliament over the course of the next few weeks. Discussions, I'm sure, that will be taken about absolute insight, supported by SPICE, IFS and others, about the detail that exists within the budget and the supporting documents. It perhaps reinforces the point I think we've been making in this report and in others about, and indeed I think echoed by the Finance Public Administration Committee, about just that clarity of information that's required to support effective scrutiny could be improved than we've seen up until now.
Is there a sense, though, however, that if you're going to... you talked a little bit about the NHS, social care and social security budgets. We all know the direction of travel of those budgets. They're becoming an ever-increasing chunk of expenditure for the government. So presumably any announcement, whatever those numbers are, whether it's 1%, 3%, 5% increases, will either cannibalise into the wider Scottish budget, the total pie available, or is reliant on some extra and additional cash at the moment, of which the value of which is unknown. But we do know roughly the value of the spending commitments. So is there a sense that some of the issues you've raised around, you talk about balancing the books, that may be the case, but making big spending announcements where there's not any clear and backup and identifiable source for how these will be funded. Are we able to follow the money in that respect, or is it still a lack of transparency and clarity?
So I think there's more to be done on these points. And social security is an important example. I think as we set out paragraph 15, these aren't all the Scottish Government spending choices, and it is for the Scottish Government and for the Parliament to consider. And these sometimes will follow UK Government and result in Barnett consequentials, but that's for decision for the Scottish Government. So I think as we set out, in terms of social security, the Fiscal Commission is forecasting that the Scottish Government will spend £1.5 billion more on social security than it receives from the UK Government in Barnett consequentials. So not always a direct link back to the UK spending review. We also reference, I think, both in today's report, but especially our NHS overview report that we published earlier this week, and I look forward to briefing the committee on that shortly, is that it too is consuming an ever-growing part of the Scottish budget. The need for reform across the public sector is the government's intended ambitions to deliver sustainable public services that are affordable. What we're missing is the detail of that. So how we move from the in-year budget process and the cycle and approval to a clear map of what is the plan to have both high quality but affordable public services. So I think we've set out quite clearly in today's report is that there are missing elements that allow both the public and the Parliament the ability to discharge effective scrutiny on some of these. It won't just be 12-month spending commitments. These are long-term decisions.
What are some of the elements you think are missing in terms of transparency from the government that allow the public to make an informed decision as to where this money is coming from?
So I think we're quite clear that a medium-term financial strategy, a clear capital programme, infrastructure investment pipeline, looking to see the detail of what the government intends by its stated plan to report a fiscal sustainability delivery plan. I think that will be vital. And then together with that, the separate but equally important medium-term financial framework for the NHS. All of these documents, I think, will support better understanding, transparency of how public services will be affordable beyond the 12-month cycle.
You just said in your last answer that the report highlights that social security spending will be £1.5 billion more due to devolved spending decisions, which again are policy decisions for policy makers. I understand that, so I'm not asking for comment on the policy itself, but the facts are that they're spending more than they're getting in that portfolio. Presumably that is unsustainable, and the money has to come from somewhere.
I'm not sure we've reached that position on it. These will be spending decisions for the Scottish Government to make, and I think and Richard might want to say more of this, because I think there is a tale and a history to this in respect of the fiscal framework that intends for the Scottish Government's ability to make separate spending choices, supported by the levers that it has to develop the Scottish economy and growth, that these are balanced in terms of revenue and expenditure. But it is clear, drawing on the Fiscal Commission's forecasts, and these actually, I think inevitably will be subject to change as well, Deputy Convener. I think in the Fiscal Commission's announcement that came out after the budget, that they hadn't factored in the intention. Forgive me, it was either the two-child benefit cap. Thank you, into the forecast. So that will change. So there are many moving parts, but I think there's an opportunity, an important opportunity, to have a broader assessment of what the medium to longer term implications of some of these important decisions to support effective scrutiny of the budget when it goes through. But again, I think,
do we not, and just before Richard comes in, do we not have a problem there though, in the sense that if all the news headlines last night were around this particular policy, which I'm not going to comment on the specifics of the policy, but there was a lot of focus on that policy announcement. But as we discovered, we don't know how much that's going to cost. In fact, there's dispute over how much it's going to cost if it was to be implemented, if it passes in the final budget. I mean, how can we be in a position where ministers are standing up in the Parliament or going on the TV and saying we're introducing this policy, but no one's got a clue how much it costs? And even if there are estimates which are £200 to £300 million per annum from one independent source, that's not even been fed into the budget process. So it's not been factored in to the assumptions that are made around the wider budget. I mean, if you were to do that on every policy, you could announce what you like, but if there's nothing in the small print that says this is how we came to that number, this is how we know as a government how much this is going to cost the public purse. I mean, surely that's that in the long term doesn't feel like a sustainable way to run a budget.
So I think there are, as we say in the report, there are significant risks to sustainable public spending. We're clear on that there isn't enough reliable, high-quality information beyond 12 months to support effective scrutiny and for the public's awareness and understanding of the fiscal risks than we currently have. And clearly, as parliamentarians, that feels like a gap. That there needs to be a medium-term financial strategy, capital plan, NHS plan, clarity on what the fiscal sustainability delivery plan to support parliamentary scrutiny and understanding of financial decisions that don't just apply 12 months. So looking at the slightly challenging area of public sector pay and public sector workforce. So as we identify in the report that public sector pay awards are one of the key drivers of the need for financial intervention to balance the books through the emergency budgets. Inevitably, given the government's commitment to no compulsory redundancies, is that these are baked in from one year to the next. But without that level of clarity about how you're going to bridge, whether it's nearly £2 billion as the most recent forecast, or if it's a number larger or smaller, we don't yet know because we haven't seen the medium-term financial strategy, is that these are all missing parts of the suite of information that we think is necessary to make informed choices. Richard?
Yeah, a couple of things. If I may also touch on the transparency point as well. So, in previous budget years, one of the issues has been that budgets are often compared to the next year's budget, and what that's meant in the Finance and Public Administration commented on this in last year's budget scrutiny, is that it's not really reflecting whether or not things have gone up or down in the middle. So a move towards looking to reflect that does add something alongside the budget to budget, which kind of gives a bit of an understanding about how these things fit together. On the fiscal framework and the social security spending, so as the Auditor General said, the key facet of the fiscal framework and the devolved powers that flowed from it was the ability of the Scottish Government to do things differently than in the rest of the UK. So most notably, the Auditor General has referred to the report that's coming next month on Scottish income tax. So Scottish income tax has resulted in block grant additions to the budget. Social security and differential social security policies has led to an increase in spending from it. That's okay, and that's in line with if that's in line with how they would like to spend their money and what their priorities are. The overall challenge is, well, how sustainable is that over the medium term? Do we know? And this is why setting that out over the medium term is really important, because it highlights what the future costs would be from that and what the associated consequences of that are for other areas of spending, should you so wish. And it allows you to plan against the scenarios of that. So this is why those elements of reform, medium-term planning, but longer-term planning as well, we talk about in the report what the SFC have said around what's going to happen over the next 50 years. This is why all these things are really important to understand.
Are you surprised or indeed disappointed that we don't have medium-term financial strategies from a government? It seems to me like a real basic of governance of public finances is to produce this high-level strategy, but yet year on year we seem to have criticisms that it doesn't exist.
I think that's a question from here on. I think it's a necessary feature of transparent suite of financial reporting. And as I said to Mr. Beattie, that yes, inevitably the UK spending review, that when that is produced, will allow for a more up-to-date, accurate, perhaps reliable assessment of future forecasts. But I'm not sure it's a strong enough justification not to have produced one, especially given that UK spending decisions don't always reflect the decisions that the Scottish Parliament will make, as we've touched on, especially around the divergence of social security approaches, and then more broadly, as we touched on in the paper, that the Scottish public sector workforce, the model that's adopted both in terms of size and pay, equally doesn't flow directly from the choices that the UK government makes either, as is entirely appropriate. So not having these forecasts, I think, is a missing component and a barrier to effective scrutiny by the Parliament.
And just finally, do we get the feeling or the impression that the Scottish Government is year on year firefighting its budget by making in-year changes, so emergency measures which take money out of one budget and move them into another? So if you look over the last 2 years, we've seen been money pumped into pay awards, pensions, social security and health and social care, but that's come at the expense of agriculture, energy, housing, ferry services, education. So other portfolios are, your money's getting sucked out of them in the middle of the year to be put in plugging gaps because policy decisions are being made and spending commitments are being made that have to be fulfilled now, not just on an annual basis, but as you rightly say, over a medium-term period. I mean, that to me feels like a very short-term way to manage your budget year on year. It's a bit like getting up in the morning, deciding how much am I going to spend today rather than looking towards the rest of the week or the month. I mean, again, does that point towards a picture of stability, of good governance of public money?
It's clearly suboptimal, having to apply emergency spending controls and interventions during the middle of the year to balance the budget. I don't think it creates a system of effective public spending and clarity for budget holders or for those relying and receiving on those public services. So having a budget, notwithstanding that events can happen, whether it's an inflation shock or public sector pay decisions or other factors, but having a scenario that can then be deployed, that one is clear on what the implications of those spending decisions would be much more preferable, but also setting a budget that is sufficiently robust that it can steer through a 12-month period will be better supported by having those medium-term forecasts.
Thank you, Auditor General. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And you'll be delighted to learn I've only got one budget-related question for you before I move on to some other final areas. And it's something you touched on earlier on, which is the ScotWind leasing revenues. So the announcement yesterday was over £300 million of those revenues will be spent on their originally intended purpose, which is presumably to reinvest in the kind of green agenda, renewables and so on. But in your report in Exhibit 5, you identify that the revenue raised from that wasn't 300 million, it was 756 million pounds. So I guess my question is, what's your sense of where the rest of it's gone? Has that been spent as part of the general expenditure in year, or is it to be earmarked for something else in the future?
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Carol actually can say a bit more of this, because it's something we've been tracking through both the audit of the Scottish Government and this report. But I think it is fair to say, as came through in the budget, that, and also in emergency spending controls, that the ScotWind funding was identified, firstly as part of the emergency spending controls, as a key component of what the government would term as its path to balance. So it was intended to really to support the government's revenue position, largely driven by public sector pay awards. That was, in a sense, the balance of the monies, because you're right, it didn't just relate to this financial year. Some of that had already been used. I think we can say what we can today. If we need to give a bit more detail, we can do so.
Yeah, so I don't know the exact figure. I think it was about 200, just over 200 million was built into the 24-25 budget from the beginning, that it would be used as part of the setting of that budget. As the Auditor General has said, the remaining 460 million was then used as part of the kind of plans for the emergency kind of savings and additional funding spend during the year. So that used up all of the, or would have used up all of the funding that was available through that route.
Sorry, just because I was never very good at arithmetic, you mentioned 200 million and 450, but the figure in here is 756. So is there a missing 100 million pounds somewhere?
I think a small amount was used in previous years, but I think Fiona maybe knows it.
Just to confirm that I think additional funding from ScotWind had been used in previous emergency budget reviews processes, but we can come back with the detail on that, if that would be helpful.
Okay, thanks. That would be helpful.
Hopefully give the committee a bit of a reconciliation, as it were, of how much was raised, what was spent and what's left.
Great. So turning to particularly what you've said in the report about progress on public service reform, and there is a certain clarity about what you're saying in that section of this Section 23 report. I mean, you are fairly blunt in saying things like the Scottish Government does not know what savings will result from reform or what reform efforts will cost. That's paragraph 68. You say the Scottish Government's governance arrangements for reform were ineffective and have recently changed. The Scottish Government is not providing effective leadership on reform. And in paragraph 87, you say the impact on outcomes is not currently considered or monitored as part of the reform process. So it's not considered at all, and neither is it. I mean, these are fairly fundamental criticisms of the Scottish Government's approach to public service reform, are they not?
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterisation, Convener. I think we think there is not been enough progress, the adequacy of arrangements to support delivery, the leadership that the Scottish Government has provided to public bodies around public service reform, clarity of where it intends to get to, milestones, the detail of the plans that would be needed. While, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen and have been reported effective examples of public service reform by public bodies, these are not of yet of the scale that would be necessary to support the size of transformation that is required to deliver high quality public services that are sustainable. And you'll see, Convener, we make recommendations in today's report which we hope will be helpful to the Government to support a more structured, transparent programme of public service reform.
Yeah. Because again, you highlight something which is a familiar theme to the Public Audit Committee and to your reports, what to all intents and purposes is an implementation gap. Because there is a government ambition stated, but delivery on the ground doesn't match up to that, is the kind of summation of what you're saying in this report today, isn't it?
Yes, it is actually, and perhaps I think it's not just us that's saying that. I think it's perhaps important to say, and maybe just highlight for the committee Exhibit 9 to today's report, where we draw on some of the examples that public bodies themselves are citing as some of the barriers to effective delivery of public service reform programme. One of which we've touched on already today about a spend to save fund, clarity around the size of the public sector workforce. The government themselves have noted that it's their view that they need to right size, and borrowing their language, the public sector workforce, but not clarity of what that actually means in terms of what's required of different people working in the public sector over time. Inevitably, investment in capital programmes as we adopt more digital services safely, taking members of the public with us, avoiding digital exclusion that the committee will be familiar with, will be part of that too. But it's that coherence of a rounded programme with a clear plan and milestones, rather than what seems to be the government's intention is a rolling programme that is consultative, bottom-up, drawing on ideas. And we're seeing, as I mentioned, examples of public service reform in individual bodies, but not that overarching clarity of what the government's intention is with specific dates into the future of a scale that will be meaningful to support fiscal sustainability.
Yeah, because the government strategy, as I read it, is that they are opposed to a top-down approach, as they describe it, I think, which is an interesting idea. But I think your conclusion from that is that then leaves a bit of a vacuum and a lack of leadership. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, I think that is a fair assessment, that notwithstanding the barriers that have been set out, is that it's not clear where we're planning to get to with a programme of public service reform, what the vision for public services look like, the size of workforce. There are various examples and work streams that the Scottish Government set out, and it's perhaps kind of appropriate to bring Fiona in and can say a bit more about our assessment of these. But work is progressing. So, for example, about the overall vision, work's progressing in several areas, but a lack of clarity about the overall vision of what's intended. So I think there is work to do, building on some of the successes. I think it's fair to say, but can these be applied at scale across public services? And as with a dominance of a convening bottom-up approach, it's not perhaps giving the clarity about what the end point will be that brings us back to the government's intention to deliver fiscally sustainable public services and using public service reform as a model for that.
Thank you. As we set out in paragraph 67, we can see a number of programmes under the work streams of about 30 activities that range quite widely in scale. And I think as part of our review, it was hard to identify progress against each activity and details on costs and timelines across those.
Yeah, I mean, and because one of the things that really struck me was just in that section, but I think a couple of paragraphs later on, you say that despite the Scottish Government contacting public bodies 3 times since January 2023 to assess their ability to carry out reform, you say these requests did not generate concrete information on the quantity, quality or anticipated impact of public bodies' collective work on reform. I mean, that's a fairly basic requirement, isn't it? And what's your understanding of the reason why they didn't elicit any useful answers from the public bodies that they spoke to 3 times?
So I think there's a couple of factors here. I think one which we've touched on to a degree already, I suppose, but go back to the budget setting process where accountable officers were already saying, budgets are stretched. We've seen whether if in some parts of the public sector haven't had the real terms increase in spending that others have had. So if you haven't been working in NHS or social security and you're part of a portfolio of spending that's perhaps faced less real terms increases or flat cash and so forth, you might not either have the capacity to support public service reform or indeed a clear understanding of the government's intention. I think it's one of the points we make in today's report. So without that detailed information or detailed clarity on the vision, I am somewhat sympathetic to public leaders to say, well, what's really being asked of them? Many will have, and we can give some examples, Convener, of the type of ideas around public service reform that have come through. But it's perhaps quite telling that we've seen over maybe the past 12 months that we've seen a real drive from the Minister for Public Finance to make progress on a broader assessment of corporate spending information than had been available. It goes back to the point Carol made earlier about the need for clearer data to support public service reform decisions. I think there's a variety of factors, but I think that kind of sums up our assessment of it. But it may be actually, the Scottish Government themselves will be better placed to give the committee an understanding of kind of why it hasn't had the momentum that they might have expected. But if you're content, I may kind of Fiona to bring some colour to that.
Thank you. I think as the third of those commissions was the corporate cost information that was published around the same time as our report. I think that was a positive step forward in terms of aggregation and clarity of intent in terms of the information that was requested. But it didn't include significant information on the reform agenda.
I mean, because we took evidence at the committee just a couple of weeks ago about digital exclusion, and you produced a report on that several months ago. And I would have thought that a public body being asked by the Scottish Government 3 times to give evidence of action they're taking to implement some kind of public service reform would have at least looked to digitisation or a change in the way that services are delivered, whether we agree with that or not. But I would have thought that would be an obvious go-to place for lots of these public bodies who were asked information about what they were doing to reform the service that they provide.
I don't think that's unreasonable. That digitalisation, the use of the public sector estate are among the themes that the government has identified to support its public service reform agenda. But it perhaps it's that tension between a bottom-up approach and an overarching clarity of strategy coming from the Scottish Government. If you're a leader in a small public body, you may be thinking, well, I'm not sure I've got the capacity to deliver a digitisation approach for my own organisation. I may not have the skills. I'm not necessarily got clarity about what my budget is going to be 2, 3, 4 years down the line, given that this will be a project. Am I expected to deliver this programme on my own? Do I need to work with other public bodies? So I think it speaks to, as I say, Convener, that tension between having a local approach in an individual public body to one that is clarity of where the government is leading an overall approach to public service reform, both in terms of whether it's digitalisation, the use of the public sector estate, which we spoke about with the committee last year, and then that challenging part of, and does this have any implication for structures? Because I think that is referred to in a number of places, but not real that clarity about what the overall shape and size of the public sector will look like either.
Yeah, because again, you reference in the report that there is a lack of data about workforce, estates and so on. And I know it's not completely analogous, and I may be stretching things a little bit, but Scottish Canals were in front of us a couple of years ago, on consecutive years, because they failed to carry out a proper asset audit to comply with the standards expected. And yet, in a sense, in your report, you're saying the Scottish Government doesn't really know what assets, what estate it's got, never mind the valuation of it. I mean, there appears to be big gaps in information here.
So effective information is a gap, and we touched on some of the reasons for that and the steps that are being taken. Colleagues might want to say a bit more of this, but I think the first thing I would maybe say is about the estate itself. Memory serves me correct. 12 months ago, we produced a report and the committee took evidence on the use of Scottish Government's infrastructure. Key part of that will be around public service reform, but the intent remains that this is confined to administrative buildings rather than the use of operational assets, some of which will have been in use for 50, 60 years, as to and whether or not they will be part of how we will deliver public services in the future or not. So there are various strands and threads to this, Convener, but I think our overall view is that we've not seen enough clarity and leadership to support an effective programme of public service reform into the future.
Okay. You mentioned as well in the report, just on governance arrangement, that there is a new board, a PSR board that's been established. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Who's on it? What its terms of reference are? What its plan of action is?
Yeah, certainly. Fiona can say a bit more about that. As we set out paragraph 71 of today's report, really the need for improvements in public sector reform governance, but that there have been some developments under the leadership for the Director General for Communities. But Fiona can set that out for the committee.
Thank you. So yes, in spring this year, it was agreed that a more formal governance arrangement was required. There were some delays to that, but the first meeting of the group was in September. The difference between the new governance arrangements and the previous governance arrangements are around the powers of the board, which will have the authority to direct PSR work and establish existing areas of work, and significantly will also be able to draw on the resources from across government. The board has only met once as far as at time of reporting, so it's too early to see if this will have a significant impact on speeding up the progress of the programme.
I don't think speeding up and that sentence really fits, does it? I mean, not for the first time the committee's hearing about structures being established that are not really meeting, which rather belies the priority that's been afforded, I would have thought. I mean, are the minutes of the board published?
Not published, as far as we're aware.
Okay. I mean, I forgive me. I mean, these are matters we will probably raise with the Scottish Government, but I just, in order to help us to understand what the answer might be, it would be. We've got some questions that we're putting to you about it.
If I may, Convener, I think that's. I think there is you could be forgiven for thinking there's a pattern in terms of adequacy of implementation of policy intent. The effectiveness of governance that's absolutely necessary to support the implementation of key strategies isn't the first time that the committee has heard this. And I think something as fundamental as public service reform ought to have had more effective governance around it right from the outset than we've seen up until now. So whilst welcoming the changes that are intended, I think as Fiona reasonably says, it's probably too early to say whether those will yet be effective.
Thank you. I've just got a couple of final questions. Graham Simpson, I think, wants to come in as well, but I'll bring you in shortly, Graham. But I just wanted to touch on a couple of things that we thought were important to to get your answers to us on the record about. And that is one of the weaknesses which you cite is the way in which equalities and human rights impact assessments are dealt with. And whether or not they're built into the beginning of decisions about public service reform or not. Do you want to outline for us how you think decision-making is being enacted and whether or not equality and human rights impact assessments are part of that, or they're an afterthought, or actually they're not given sufficient priority at all?
I'll happily start off on that, and again, I'll bring colleagues in to set out and perhaps draw to the committee's attention Exhibit 1 on today's report, just about is considering the impact of changes to spending, whether that's done on an emergency basis, as we've seen and explored in recent weeks with the emergency spending controls and how adequately they're approached, or then whether it's done on a more planned basis, such as public service reform. Colleagues can talk to that, but I think what we're keen to see, I guess the next iteration of that, convener, is that there's a much clearer connection between spending, reform, and then the intended outcomes through the national outcomes. And we, clear in today's report that, just referencing paragraph 94, about as the government moves forward with its programme of public service reform, that it can clearly track the implications of those changes to different groups in society. You referenced, for example, digital exclusion. There's an inevitability that as a society we'll adopt digital more and more. Public services will be delivered in a digital way, but that people have got an equitable access to public services, and there's a clarity of approach to deliver upon that. I'll pause, convener, and if Fiona and Richard might want to say a bit more about that.
Thank you, convener. As part of our evidence collection for the audit, we found that at an overall level for the PSR programme, there wasn't a consideration of equalities and human rights. I think our understanding is that consideration is happening at a lower level, but we're not seeing it pulled all together at the programme level. And the Auditor General has made a recommendation that the equalities and human rights should be built into decisions about public service reform to understand the impact on people.
Yeah.
I think there's a general theme with that about how the leadership of the Scottish Government really is about bringing together some of those things. Probably relates to your last question as well around the activity. I think it's fair to say that reform will be delivered by public bodies and the Scottish Government working together, which means they need to understand what each other need. So the Auditor General has pointed you towards Exhibit 9, which sets out some of those requests around, well, we need the capacity, we need the digital, and conversely, the Scottish Government saying, well, we need better data about what your corporate costs are and what your workforce costs are, and therefore what the opportunities are to make efficiencies or reform within that. Just finally, we do highlight as well on page 31 a case study of the emergency budget review. Again, it's about learning the lessons from things that we believe were good practice and worked. So the ability to set out more clearly what the effects on outcomes could be of making those immediate decisions, which exist there is an example of the type of thing that we think that the Scottish Government could do more of.
Yeah, okay. I mean, because there has been a view expressed in the past that these equality impact assessments and all that, it's part of the red tape that we need to get rid of. I mean, is your understanding that the government's position is that they do think it's important that there are equality impact and human rights impact assessments of changes?
Yes, I do. I think that's a fair assessment. I don't detect any glib approach to equalities impact assessments from the Scottish Government. I think that the importance is that they're done in a rounded way, they're done at the right time, rather than, I think, as the committee has seen on a couple of occasions, I think I've reported that there's a retrospective approach to equalities impact assessment. These need to be done right at the front and as to inform the decision-making approach rather than than an afterthought, convener. But I certainly wouldn't characterise the government's approach as being one that it feels like a bolt-on, no.
Thanks very much. I think that's very helpful. Well, they're all my questions, but I think Graham Simpson has got a final one to put to you.
Yeah, thanks,
Graham.
convener. It was just going back to the whole issue of reform. I suppose we could probably agree that reform isn't necessarily about saving money, although it might save money. Ultimately, it's about doing things better, I think. So better outcomes for the people we're all here to serve. That might save money, which would be a benefit. But I was concerned, and the convener has already touched on paragraph 70 in your report, but if I could point to paragraph 69 as well, where you say that all portfolios, all Scottish Government portfolios, were required to lay out their savings and reform plans by the end of the financial year. And then, of course, in paragraph 70, you talk about public bodies being asked 3 times to assess their ability to carry out reform. Both those paragraphs give the impression of either departments, portfolios, or public bodies refusing to play ball on reform. They're not giving the information required. Is that your assessment?
I think that would probably be a step beyond what I think we're saying in today's report. It's not a deliberate attempt to obfuscate the government's requests or intention, but it's, I think, as we say, not generate concrete information on the quality of the Scottish public bodies' intention to deliver reform in paragraph 70. Perhaps goes back to the point I think we're making in the report that there needs to be not just a bottom-up approach, but a real clarity of intent from the Scottish Government about what it wants to achieve to deliver those outcomes that you quite fairly say, Mr Simpson, that it's not just about saving money. If I may stray into NHS, for example, one of the reforms the Cabinet Secretary Health and Social Care outlines is, and part of his vision is to move to a preventative-based model, a primary care-based model rather than an acute setting. Yeah. So that will deliver, if applied and works well, a more cost-effective and better outcomes for people. The clarity of vision around public service reform in the round is the next step, so that public bodies are better able to engage and bridge what I think there are examples of in today's report of an implementation gap and understanding of what's expected of them.
Do you think then what's required is more leadership from the top, from the government, to tell either their own departments or public bodies what it is they're looking for?
Yes, that's one of today's key findings.
Yeah.
That there needs to be clearer leadership from the Scottish Government to support public parliamentary understanding and to support public bodies' ability to engage in public service reform, what the longer term outcomes are going to be. There's a clear plan with milestones attached to it so that they can engage effectively. Parliament and the public can scrutinise it alongside that.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. And I think that brings to an end this evidence session. So can I thank you, Auditor General, for your time and your input this morning. Can I also thank Carol Grant, Fiona Diggle and Richard Robinson for your contribution too. It's been greatly appreciated, and I think you've set a useful platform for us upon which we may stand and ask some questions of the Scottish Government. So again, thank you very much indeed for your evidence this morning, and I will now move the meeting into private session.